in home and community-based services, people with disabilities and their families, older people are waiting for services, and we cannot offer them because there isn't enough funding in the system and because the workers are underpaid and cannot sustain doing this work. So there's a huge amount that we need to do in order to secure our care infrastructure to enable our economic recovery. And the American Rescue Plan is a really important, it really points the way forward for us.
Thank you so very much for your expert testimony. And I want to thank all of the witnesses, Madam Chairman. And I appreciate the fact that this hearing demonstrates that we can't just deal with the pandemic in terms of a response, that we need cures that go far beyond the pandemic. And I trust that the Congress will understand that gaps in pay for women, the time has simply come where it can no longer exist, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you very much. The gentle lady from Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz, is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. For many working mothers, the pandemic added new child care demands that forced them to step back from the workplace or really even leave it altogether. And in fact, since the start of the pandemic, women saw a net loss of more than 5.4 million jobs. As many as 1 in 4 women who reported becoming unemployed during the pandemic attributed it to a lack of child care, according to one analysis. That was twice the rate reported by men. Ms. Pooh, how has the strain of child care demands during the pandemic pushed moms out of the workplace?
Working moms in the pandemic were simply unable to manage the impossible choices before them, to figure out how to work and take care of their children who were home from daycares that were closed, schools that were closed, managing online learning while trying to work remotely if that was an option for them. And it was simply too much to bear. And the truth is that our lack of supports for caregivers, from working moms, for family caregivers coming into the pandemic was already incredibly tenuous. It was already unsustainable. What happened with the pandemic was essentially it made it completely untenable for huge numbers of women, especially women of color. And so it's the straw that broke the camel's back. And now we're back at 1988 levels of women's workforce participation. We've got to address this if we're to recover from this pandemic.
There's no question about it. 1988 levels is the year I graduated from college. So that is basically my entire adult life. And I'm the founder of the informal Moms in House Caucus. We have a record number of women in Congress with school-age children. And I'm concerned that if Congress fails to take bold action to address this, that we're going to have many more mothers that are permanently forced out of the workplace. So thank you for your feedback. Dr. Mason, what kind of barriers do mothers face when trying to re-enter the labor force?
Well, what we know is that unless we're able to get the pandemic under control, which we're working really hard to do, and schools open and daycares open, women will not be able to re-enter the workforce in any significant way. And so barriers that women face to re-entering the workforce is care. We've already talked a lot about that. But also the predictability of being able to search for a new job. If you don't know when schools are going to reopen, if you don't have a available daycare slot or you're on a wait list, it makes it really hard to predict or apply for jobs or accept a job because you just don't know. It's just so unpredictable. The other barriers that women face is that it's the idea that there will not be a one-for-one recovery for those jobs that have been lost. So some women will have to enter new sectors altogether. And so there is a real need for education and training in this moment and making sure that women have the economic supports they need while they receive training flourishing and also so that they are able to take care of their families.
Thank you. Really, in order to get our nation's economy back on track, we have to address America's child care crisis as part of our pandemic recovery. The American Rescue Plan thankfully made serious headway in easing the gap that our child care infrastructure has by providing $40 billion to help support families and providers. The historic expansion of the child tax credit helped so many low-income women and families that will finally be lifted out of poverty and receive long overdue relief. But we have to gain a multi-pronged approach to support families so they can go back to work and send their children back to childcare. One additional step is enacting the Child Care for Working Families Act, which I'm proud to have joined Chairman Bobby Scott in introducing last Congress. And that would make child care more affordable across the United States and foster the development of a more robust child care workforce. I can tell you, as a mother of 3 children who are well beyond child care age now, the sticker shock that you face when you are trying to make sure that you can return to work and be able to afford the huge percentage of your income, particularly as a woman, that childcare usually costs, is a massive obstacle. And so many families and couples have to decide whether it's worth it to actually have the mother usually go back to the labor force and rather than stay home and not have that huge childcare bill eat into their overall income. So thank you so much, Madam Chair. Thank you for doing this very important hearing today. Let's hope this is one of the last equal pay days.
Thank you. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Donalds.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Panelists, thank you so much for being here with us this morning. I want to get right to it. I don't want to get into a bunch of, leading speeches. But Ms. Onwuka, I got a question for you. Obviously the pandemic has created major issues for everybody across the country, including women. We've seen massive losses in jobs. We've seen communities shut down. We've seen schools closed for far too long, quite frankly, which has actually led to a lot of families not being able to return to work or being put in a tough place with respect to, are they going to frankly watch their kids at home or be able to rejoin the labor force? And these things have occurred for a multitude of reasons that go far beyond what my colleagues want to talk about, which is what they perceive to be the discrimination against women. My question for you specifically is, do you believe that pay gaps as they exist are based solely on sex discrimination, or do you believe that there are other nuances that impact this?
Congressman, thank you for your question. I absolutely do believe that the pay gap is driven by other factors, a number of controllable factors. When you control for those things, everything from your occupation. We've heard about women not earning, dominating certain sectors and still not out earning men in those sectors that they dominate. Well, when you look at the distribution of where women are in those sectors, in an occupation, for example, when you look at nursing, for example, male nurses earn more than 18% than female nurses. Why? Well, not surprisingly, they are in the better, higher paying specialties. They're working longer hours. So when we talk about all of these different factors, hours, occupation, time out of the workforce, they all layer together to contribute to that pay gap. And I hope that comes across in today's discussion. And it's not just all about the gender and even racial discrimination.
Let me ask you a follow-up question to that. Do you think that any of the new entitlements that, were put into whatever that bill is we passed 2 weeks ago, the coronavirus bill, whatever they want to call it, do you think that any of these new entitlements are actually, ease these burdens, or do you think it's just going to paper over the burdens that already exist and the disparities that already exist based upon the other factors that you cited?
Well, I think certain people will absolutely feel a little bit more in their pockets if they were already receiving those entitlements. But when you're talking about individuals who, are not direct beneficiaries, they want to get back to work. They're not interested in necessarily, becoming dependent on government entitlements. They're looking for, an open economy in their state and their city that allows them to regain the workforce. Whether you're talking about a service person in the service industry, whether you're talking about someone in the hotel industry. While we appreciate direct targeted aid, which it's questionable if the recent package was, but that's temporary. What we need is a robust economy that generates opportunities of different kinds that meets the unique interest and situations of certain people. Not everybody wants to work a 40-hour week. Not everyone wants to work in a physical location. Some people want to work from home. Some people don't even want to be employees, and they're not interested in unionization either. So I think we need an economy that generates those types of opportunities, a breadth of them.
No, thank you for that. I mean, in the rest of my time, what I would state is that, like I said, the pandemic has been something that's been highly impactful to all people in our country, all socioeconomic levels of our country. But let's be very clear: if the local school is closed and your kids are school age, like my children are, it makes a major impact into what happens into the working lives of the families that have to care for those kids. I've heard that from members of my own community, my constituency, where it's real issues about, can the kids go back to school? That has major impacts. I would also say that what we're also witnessing, as destructive as the pandemic has been to the economic lives of so many Americans, including women, especially women of color, is that the economy is also transforming. We are seeing that a lot of companies are now deciding to go to hybrid schedules and hybrid calendars. We are seeing that there are companies who are trying to think about, are they actually going to continue having office hours for 40 hours a week or more, because they've realized that they've not missed a beat through the pandemic in the white collar professions. And so I think what we're going to see through the free market is a move that gives more people the flexibility to continue to go up the economic ladder, in spite of the family decisions that exist, in spite of some of the cultural issues and community issues that do exist. So with that, I'll yield back the rest of my time, but I will say I'm not sure that federal legislation is necessary to do what the free market is going to take care of on its own, like it typically does. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welsh, is now recognized. Mr. Welsh.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. First of all, I want to really thank the witnesses who I think have been incredibly helpful in their clarity on this really important issue. And it seems to me there's really two things that have come out here. One is that there is unequal pay, obviously. And number two, that it's not just about a choice. And it's not even just about employers who want to pay as little as they can. That's not necessarily the case. It's a question of what the choices are that are realistically available to women who bear the major responsibility of childcare and home care. And I want to ask Dr. Mason whether in Vermont we have 91%, we have the closest men and women getting equal pay. It's 91% for women, and that adds up to $5,000 a year on our average wages, which is real money. But in the pandemic, we've had many more women who have left the labor force and not been able to come back, and particularly women who have childcare responsibilities with children. So what I'd like you to do is answer some of these questions that have been raised, mostly from my Republican colleagues, about the choice in this question of how is it possible for a person to have choice if their options are limited because of inadequate daycare or family leave or other things that should be, in my view, governmental policies. Dr. Mason?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right on Congressman Welch. These are constrained choices. They're not true choices. They are limited choices that women have. During the pandemic, I am a single mom. I work 40 to 50 hours a week and also responsible for homeschooling my children. I feel very fortunate to be able to work from home.
By the way, interrupt. God bless you. I mean, if you managed to do that, you have got a job.
I have but the truth of the matter is that this burden, I don't want to call it a burden, but this experience right now in the pandemic, it is the experience that many women have been, juggling before the pandemic, and responsibility has only increased during the pandemic. And so, again, women spend 30% more have 30% more caretaking responsibilities in their families compared to men. And so when schools close, daycares close, the expectation is that women would take on that additional work and burden. And because of the pay gap, when families are making decisions about who should leave and who should stay in the workforce, if they have a two-person income household, it's the person who makes the least. But that's not fair. It's a choice that women and families shouldn't have to make.
Thank you. No, thank you. In Vermont, we are having a real debate in the state legislature about paid family leave. And one of the concerns that's raised by business is who's going to pay for it. I think that's a legitimate concern. Mm-hmm. But on the private market is not going to pay for it. And that seems to be a theme on some of my colleagues on the other side that leave this to the market. But in fact, the market doesn't pay for elementary education. We've made certain decisions as a society that should be socialized. The provision of public education, obviously the defense of our country, is paid family leave something, I'll ask Ms. Pooh, that should in fact be socialized, that we took a step towards that with the provisions that were in the American Rescue Package.
I believe absolutely it should. I am a believer that that when the market can solve a problem, it should. And when it can't, the government, that is the role of government. And when we have collective shared needs that are about the fundamental health and well-being of society and our families, we have to ensure that these challenges get solved. And all of us working have families. And most children are growing up in households. 70% of kids in this country are growing up in households where all the adults in the household work outside of the home. So in that instance, we need to invest as a government in our caregiving programs and policies in a totally different way for the 21st century.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, is now recognized. Mr. Johnson.
I thank the chair for holding this hearing, and I appreciate the testimony from today's witnesses. To quote sociologist Jessica Calarco, quote, "Other countries have social safety nets. The U.S. has women," end quote. Here on Equal Pay Day, I'm particularly concerned about the consequences of the gender pay gap for working mothers and families and the continued discrimination against women who are also mothers. Now, Ms. Onwuka, I appreciate your testimony today. You've stated that mothers make less than fathers because mothers favor time off, whereas men don't take time off, and that time off makes women happy and feel a sense of fulfillment. And men get their kicks by doing overtimes, pretty much is what you're saying. Ms. Jabola-Carolus, can you respond to that notion, please? Well, if Ms. Carolus is not available, how about you?
I'm here. Would you?
Okay, please.
For one clarification, would you just repeat that part about her point?
Well, yeah, you making me spend my time now.
Sorry.
All right, but look, Ms. Onwuka is saying that women like to take time off because, it's a matter of choice for them, and they prefer to take care of the children, whereas husbands tend to not take time off because they want to make some overtime. What is your response to that?
Well, choice requires power. And women are under an incredible amount of constraint to fulfill their gender norm role, to serve the family, to sacrifice themselves, and oftentimes are not making as much money anyway compared to if they have a male partner in the relationship. And so it's just logical, it's rational under these constraints to do that. It's not because it's a personal preference or it's advantageous necessarily.
So all that talk about fulfillment and sense of happiness and having to do this, you would not agree with that, correct?
I would not agree with it as.
Okay, and let me move to my next person. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Onwuka, do you know who Lily Ledbetter is?
Congressman, yes, and I would like to respond to Ms. characterization if possible.
And you're familiar with the fact that Miss Lily Ledbetter was working at a Goodyear plant down in Alabama. She was an area supervisor. There were 15 males doing the same job as she. She had more seniority than anybody, and she made thousands of dollars less than what her male counterparts were making. Do you think that's fair?
Sir, I'm not going to go back and talk about Lily Ledbetter because I understand.
Okay, well, then let me ask you this question. Do you think that there should be federal law that guarantees that women performing the same work as men receive equal pay as men?
I believe we have that law, those laws on the books, sir.
Well, why would this happen to Miss Lily Ledbetter?
Because in practice, different companies
Was
do different things.
Was it the free markets? Was it the free markets that caused that to happen, or was it government that caused Miss Lily Ledbetter to not be paid equal pay for equal work?
Well, you know, it's unfortunate that there are people who harbor discrimination potentially, and thank goodness that the law provides us with means of redress to adjudicate those issues. And by the way, some of the data that I was referring to earlier, sir, would you allow me to respond?
Well, yeah, I'd like for you to respond to my question. Shouldn't there be federal laws to protect women, to ensure that they receive equal pay for equal work?
And sir, I've responded that we have federal law that it ensures that you cannot be paid differently based on gender discrimination.
Why does this keep happening then?
Please repeat your question.
Why does this keep happening?
Well, you know, I think we need to empower women, number one, to seek redress when they are not compensated the way that they should be. We have an entire federal agency that does that. And then we also need to talk about education. And I appreciate and agree with a lot of my colleagues that, yeah, education is woeful for many women, particularly kids that look like you and me. And that's why I advocate for school choice, so that they can get out of the failing public school system and into maybe other options that would give them an advantage and an opportunity and expand their horizons and open them to different ways of earning greater protection.
We should let the free markets take over our public school system. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The gentle lady from California, Ms. Porter, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Dr. Mason, I wanted to talk to you about policies that harm women, specifically that hurt single mothers. The American Rescue Plan expands the child tax credit, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And how much does it increase the credit by?
It increases the credit by $3,600 for children under the age of 6 and $3,000 for other ages.
Yes, and it would lift about 4.1 million children above the poverty line, cutting the number of children in poverty by more than 40%. That's a conservative estimate. Is that right?
That is right.
But the tax credit, the child tax credit, has two different income cutoffs, right? One for married couples and one for heads of household.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And who typically files as heads of household? How do single parents of young children typically file? What is their tax status?
Single mothers, heads of single mothers are more likely to file as heads of households.
Heads of household. But
Yes,
as households have a different cutoff for the child tax credit than married couples who have
yes,
children.
that's
All
right.
So I want to break this down. A single parent making more than $112,500 a year starts to lose the child tax credit, whereas a child and a married couple doesn't start to lose that credit until their combined income is more than $150,000. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So to quote a law review article, Beyond Head of Household, Rethinking the Taxation of Single Parents, this discrepancy, quote, this discrepancy means that unmarried parents with income with the same income receive a smaller credit per child than do married parents with income in the same range. Is the cost of food for the single parent's child any less? Do children in single parent families eat less?
No.
How about the cost of school supplies, uniforms, books? Is there a discount for single parents?
No, I wish there was, in fact.
Me too. And most importantly, would the cost of childcare be any less for the child of the single parent?
No, in fact, it consumes more of single parents' income.
Because they don't have anybody else to take care of the child. If they were going to work, they need to have childcare that covers the full hours that they're working. So, and yet the tax credit treats that family differently. I like to call this the single parent penalty, but it's really the child in a single parent household penalty. The person hurt here is the child. And because we penalize single parents, we penalize their children. I think this is an outdated, backward policy that needs to change. Dr. Mason, one final question. Would fixing this penalty, bringing these two different kinds of families, both with children and the costs of raising a child born equally among them, would it help women and children? Would it help bring women into the workforce? How would it help support our economic recovery if it would?
So, first of all, there's no reason for this discrepancy in terms of phasing out for single parents. And it would definitely go a long way towards helping us to rebuild our economy, supporting those women who have been most disproportionately impacted in this moment, women who are primary wage earners in their families. It would definitely help to bring more women back into the workforce. And I have to point out that this is direct money into the pockets of working women and families. And what we have to know is since 1996, the social safety net has all but disappeared, and less than 3% of families receive any kind of cash assistance. So this is a moment where we can't afford to be making these arbitrary cuts and decisions about who should be receiving support and care.
Absolutely, I agree. I think the time to get rid of this differential treatment for children, depending on what kind of family they live in, is long overdue. The result here is we're penalizing children rather than helping children in all families equally. So I strongly support removing the single parent penalty and making sure that we're helping every single child get that benefit. You know, it's interesting, Dr. Mason, I have asked the Ways and Means Committee, I've asked the Joint Committee on Taxation, I've asked on the Senate Finance side, I've had, someone put this question to Jared Bernstein at the Council of Economic Advisors, and not one person has been able to give me a justification for why we discriminate against children in single family households this way. And I think it starts for me to be reminiscent of longstanding efforts in the tax policy to control families and define what is a good and worthy family. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Spear, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, thank you so much for holding this hearing today on Equal Pay Day. There's that old adage, you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. And I think the script that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are reading from is one that is, in all respects, probably laughable. Because for those of us who have been single parents, as Ms. Porter has just pointed out, there is great discrepancy in the law as to how those children are treated. Let me ask Ms. Onwuka, who are the biggest donors to, I presume you're from a nonprofit, is that correct?
Yes, Congresswoman.
And who are your biggest donors to your nonprofit?
I actually don't know. I just know that we are supported by many Americans across the country who believe in what we're talking about and what we're fighting for.
You're the director, so how would you not know?
I'm the director of the Center for Economic Opportunity, which is going to be launching within the next 2 weeks, but I'm not the executive or the president of this organization.
And who
I think
is?
that was maybe misstated earlier in the introductions.
And who is?
That's Carrie Lucas.
Okay. All right. I think it's really important for us to know where the funding comes from those who speak to us on both sides of the aisle. Let me move forward. My colleagues across the aisle like to argue that the gender wage gap calculated by data from the Census Bureau is a myth or a fairy tale concocted by the liberal media. They argue that the $10,000 difference between men's and women's earnings is due to women's choices. I mean, it's so offensive to me to hear that, as if being pushed out of your job because of a lack of paid leave or reasonable pregnancy accommodation or sexual harassment is somehow a meaningful choice. I'd like to remind my colleagues that the wage gap persists regardless of industry, occupation, or educational level. In fact, across all industries, women are paid less than men. Women are even paid less than men with lower levels of education. Among full-time, year-round workers, women with associate degrees are paid less than men with high school diplomas, and women with master's degrees are paid less than men with bachelor's degrees. One prominent study that looked at the causes of wage gap and examined factors such as occupation, industry, education, union status, region, and race found that 38% of the wage gap was still unexplained and could be attributed to discrimination. That's why the Paycheck Fairness Act is something that we are supportive, because the Equal Pay Act has no teeth. Ask the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg about that. Dr. Mason and Ms. Pooh, what impacts does a lack of paid family leave and affordable childcare have on the gender wage gap? Is it fair to blame the wage gap on women's choices?
Well, I will say that 2/3 of all minimum wage workers are women, and they do not have flexibility. They do not even have the ability to take time off from work to get a vaccine in a pandemic. So this is not about a lot of choices that women have. And I have not met any women in my 25 years of organizing women in the low-wage economy who would say that working a minimum wage job with no safety net, benefits, paid time off, or access to even job security was a choice of theirs. So I will say that. And I will say that we have this incredible opportunity in this moment, as we've seen what has happened to women in this pandemic, absent a real safety net and a real care infrastructure in this country, the incredible dangers of it to women and to children and all of us in the economy. We have this incredible opportunity to transform that, to invest boldly in the ability of families to work and care for their kids at the same time. And we have to do that because 60% of the American workforce earns less than $50,000 per year. The average cost of childcare is $9,000 per year, and the average cost of a private room in a nursing home is more than $90,000 per year. The numbers don't add up.
I'd like to make sure Ms. Mason has a chance to respond as well. Thank you.
I would like to echo everything that Ajahn Pooh just said, and said that this is the moment for us to really think about a robust care infrastructure that is able to meet the needs of family. As we mentioned earlier in the hearing, families and women can spend up to 30% or more of their income on care. And there is an absolute need for paid sick leave, both at the federal and state level. There is a role for the private sector to play in the absence of these federal and state regulation and laws. So there's so much work to be done. And again, we have done a really great job at articulating the pay gap. And I think we have a number of things on the table and in the legislatures to help us to close it.
Thank you. My time's expired. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Kelly, is now recognized. Ms. Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Gender inequality is not only a pressing moral and social issue, but also, as you know, a critical economic challenge. If women who account for half the country's working age population do not achieve their full economic potential, the nation's economy will suffer. A McKinsey Global Institute report finds that 12 trillion could be added to global GDP by 2025 by advancing women's equality. The public, private, and social sectors will all need to act to close gender gaps in work and society. In my hometown, a report prepared by the Chicago Foundation for Women found that if Chicago were to match best-in-class standards of gender parity, it would grow the region's gross domestic product by $58 billion by 2025. And the people that worked at a place, I had the most experience and the most education, and I got paid the least. So I have experienced this myself. So to begin to close the gender wage gap, women need updated, comprehensive, equal pay, such as the Paycheck Fairness Act, that will strengthen existing protection working family policies are also essential to truly combat the multifaceted gender wage gap so that all women proportionally assume much of the caregiving responsibilities in their family are not unfairly disadvantaged by taking time to address care needs. Just like right now, you know, instead of saying we're
having some technical difficulties with Ms. Kelly. We can come back to her. The gentleman from Maryland has recognized Mr. Sarbanes while we work on her technicality problems. Mr. Sarbanes.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I want to thank the panelists who are joining us today. Throughout this coronavirus pandemic, as we know, we've been relying extremely heavily on frontline workers to help us keep food on our tables, to continue to provide essential medical care for ourselves, for our loved ones, and to maintain essential services in the communities. So we owe a huge debt of gratitude to grocery store clerks, hospital workers, long-term care aides, other essential workers that have helped to guide us through this pandemic. We know that women are overrepresented as a share of frontline employees. The statistics are pretty significant. 2/3 of grocery store workers are female, as are 8 in 10 retail workers at other essential businesses. Women comprise 3/4 of hospital workers and more than 80% of long-term care staff. Even as they've been asked to shoulder the risks and burdens associated with the pandemic, the majority of frontline workers have continued to be paid low wages and are granted few workplace protections. Dr. Mason, are women on the front lines of the pandemic earning less than their male counterparts? Can you speak to that?
So are women earning less than men in these essential jobs, as you call them? So you just stated that women are overrepresented in this sector, but even in some instances where women are overrepresented, men still out-earn women in these sectors. What's really important to know is that not only are these lower paying jobs, but these are also jobs with few benefits, no time off, no health care. And so it really exacerbated the economic precarity that women were facing when the pandemic hit. And so when we look across who's been most impacted in this moment, it is these lower wage workers and women of color specifically. Again, when we think about recovery, it's really important to target our policy strategies, even our infrastructure bills, around those who've been most impacted in this moment. And again, it's women and women of color.
I appreciate that. That gets to the structural dimension of this that was being discussed by some of my colleagues earlier. It seems that however you want to slice or dice or frame the workforce, you will discover that there is this inequity in pay that cannot be justified by any particular lens you would put on it, other than the fact that people are not getting equal pay for equal work. And you touched on the fact that frontline workers are less likely to have access to paid sick or family leave. They're less likely to be able to telework. They have fewer workplace protections. So you're layering on top of this wage gap and pay gap all of these other additional burdens, which often disproportionately impact women in the workforce, which creates that significant burden. Ms. Jabola-Carolus, as your report notes, many public sector workers are women of color. Can you speak briefly about how the pandemic has impacted the health and economic security of these women? And then as we recover from the pandemic, how can we best support women working in both the public and private sectors? Obviously, a lot of attention to workers in certain jobs because of the pandemic. The test for the nation and as public policymakers is whether we learn those lessons, carry them forward, and build a different kind of economy on the other side of the pandemic. So if you could speak to that briefly, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you. You're absolutely correct that certain sectors were in overdrive, particularly the public sector, when we were characterizing the economic outlook as a shutdown. And in the public sector, it's really important for government to lead and be an example of what these rights should look like. But we've still seen a very punishing impact on women. There have been telework policies that are overtly sexist, that prohibit caregiving and telework, that caused confusion in Hawaii and needed to be corrected in quick time. And that's one of the things that we've seen is this hesitancy to go against productivity and use excuses like productivity and liability to not create a more flexible structure in government at the local level. So we're seeking those things currently in Hawaii. But absolutely, public sector workers have not been exempt from this, and are particularly women have been suffering.
Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Kelly, have you corrected your audio now? Ms. Kelly? There appears to be difficulty. We are now going to the gentlelady from New York. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez is now recognized.
So I sound better. It's hard for me to tell.
Okay, are we through? Are we going back to Ms. Kelly?
We're going to Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. You're now recognized.
Okay. Thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman. Ms. Jabola-Carolus, I was wondering if we could dive into a little bit a lot of the unrecognized but very real work that's been happening, especially during the pandemic, especially that's been borne by women and caregivers in general. I was wondering if you could kind of talk to us a little bit about that. What have been some of the expansions and increases in work that women have increasingly been bearing and creating and undergoing throughout the pandemic? How is it being undervalued and underrecognized? And also, how is it critical to us keeping our economy going? And I was wondering if you could kind of set the stage for us to kind of discuss about how we are not recognizing some of the critical work that's happening in our economy that's critical to its functioning.
Thank you for that question. Women are absolutely the scaffold of the economy, and mothers in particular. We are born into a society that is profoundly patriarchal. And so motherhood is almost totally invisible. I didn't even notice it until it happened to me, quite frankly. And the amount of work, the grueling work that is shrouded as love is painful to experience because it is so demanding and requires so much sacrifice. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen this being put on women, and because women already make lower wages, it's logical for them to be the one to take the hit and exit the workplace. I ask myself every day whether I should quit my job, and I am the executive director of the Commission on Women. So rather than throw statistics at you, I would just share what we've been hearing from our community, which is just overwhelming mental health stress from women who are taking on these burdens. The exodus from the workplace is true, even though it's being denied and cast as voluntary. And we will see the impact of this in the data shortly, I'm sure. But that is what I can share with you from Hawaii.
And first of all, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And one of the questions that I've kind of been asking is, how do we better recognize this work through policy, compensate for it, and do programs like Medicare for All and guaranteed childcare, healthcare, et cetera? Does this go some of the way in helping recognize this work, alleviate for it, and also, what are some real policy initiatives that we should be looking at to actually formally recognize, potentially compensate in one way or another for this kind of work, and make being a mother a realistic possibility that doesn't come at the expense of women's well-being mentally or physically in a disproportionate way?
The United States has a lot of catch up to do. There are countries around the world that provide pensions for housewives. These are the things that we should absolutely make fundamental as part of the recovery and before, right? But for me, I think, and for our plan, it was really important to go beyond just compensation. We really want equal leisure time. We want that labor to be able to be just love. We want shared responsibilities rather than it just having to be on us. So a paycheck will not be enough for that. So I think that, Medicare for all, Medicaid for all, childcare, universal childcare, no means testing, just free and available to everyone. These types of things will allow women to really be free from the demands that are put on them to sacrifice themselves for our economy.
And you bring up a point that I think is so important, which is leisure time. I think in our society, especially in U.S. and American society, it's almost seen as sinful. And I was wondering if you could expound on that and how this is actually important, critical, and element that should be afforded to all of us. I was wondering if you could expound on that aspect of things a little bit, because it's so rarely named and even discussed in public policy.
Yeah, and I think it's really important in terms of reordering the economy around, endless growth and consumption and extraction, is reducing work time, valuing the time that we have to be in relationship with each other. And so if we can move in that direction, which is already in vogue in other countries to reduce work hours, those things should just be fundamental to us, because, if the economy is not creating well-being, what is the justification for it anyway?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Lawrence, is now recognized. Ms. Lawrence.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And I want to thank you for having this very timely and important discussion. As the co-chair of the Democratic Women's Committee, we have been working very hard on supporting bills that will bring our economy back, and it's critical for us that all women have the opportunity to thrive. For example, the Paycheck Fairness Act takes us closer to closer to closing the gender pay gap, and the Family Act established a comprehensive national family leave program, and the Child Care for Working Families increased affordable child care. Dr. Mason, how can these pieces of legislation ensure that when we bring this economy back, that it's an equitable economic recovery for women, and particularly women of color. And while I'm there, I also want to ask you about the generational impact of what we do in America by having this big pay gap for women and Black women, particularly generation after generation. Thank you.
So these bundle of policies that you just mentioned, and the ones like the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, and thinking about universal childcare, and these bundle policies are really important to our short-term recovery, but also women's long-term economic security, well-being, and stability. For far too long, women have been struggling to make ends meet. These systems have been broken for so long. And so we have an opportunity, again, once in a generation opportunity, at least not seen in my lifetime, to create and build a more equitable economy that works for everyone, not just business owners and entrepreneurs, but women and families, women workers who are the backbones of the economy. Women are the economy. And so recognizing that for women of color and Black women specifically, making sure that the ways in which they're overrepresented in the service sector and lower wage jobs, women of color in general, Black women specifically. And so making sure that those jobs are quality jobs, jobs that have security, benefits, and so that, women are able to take care of their families. And again, righting some of the historic wrongs like home ownership, looking at other things that we know will make the difference in women's long-term economic security.
Thank you. And Ms. Carolus, if you could comment on the generational impact of this crisis that I feel we have in America with gender inequality.
Thank you for the question. Well, I'm coming from Hawaii into this conversation, and gender equality was forced from women by the United States. And that's an important history that we need to remember and need to resolve. And it's our responsibility to use that as a frame. And I think that if we are not able to reallocate power to women and leave them to the devices of, this recovery, then that will be less power for each subsequent generation. And so it's really leveraging this moment to create these structural changes that we've been waiting for so long and fighting for so long and agitating for so long. And so this is the moment to do that. We can't even risk entertaining what the consequences will be down the line.
Mm-hmm. I just want to say thank you again to our chair. And this is an opportunity that we have where the intersection of generational wealth, generational opportunities that we can make a difference. I want to thank everyone that's here, and we need to continue to keep our voices raised. And thank you so much, and I'll yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer, is now recognized. Mr. Comer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I said in my opening statement, women were making huge gains in the American workforce prior to the pandemic. In January 2020, for the second time in history, women outnumbered men in the U.S. paid workforce. Women outnumbered men in earning college degrees. But when the pandemic hit and the nation shut down, women have been most adversely affected. Ms. Onwuka, can you explain why women have lost more jobs than men since last February?
Thank you, Ranking Member. Yes, women tend to be aggregated in the service industry, in the leisure, in areas that have not surprisingly been hit tremendously hard by coronavirus closures, restaurants, bars, working in the travel industry. So when you are a hotel worker and there are no travelers, then you are out of work. And so it's not surprising that we've seen over 2 million, going on 3 million women leave the workforce, and particularly even women who are moms, who have who have children under 18 years old. You've seen them leave the workforce, unfortunately, because for many of them, they have to balance, virtual school and ensuring that their kids' education and their household children, everything is taken care of. And it's unfortunate, but I'm hopeful that as the economies, particularly at the state and local levels, continue to reopen, that you'll see women begin to re-enter the workforce.
Well, that leads me to my next question. What can we do in Congress to ensure that women re-enter the workforce as quickly as possible?
Well, there are some things that you can do and not do. One is not in past legislation that would unfortunately remove flexible work opportunities for women. There is a bill pending. It's been passed by the House, unfortunately, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, or the PRO Act, that has tucked in there a piece of a measure that would inevitably reclassify millions of workers across the country from being independent contractors to employees. We've seen in California similar legislation passed, and it unfortunately hit many women who are choosing to be independent contractors, small business owners. They're not employees, not W-2 employees, but they're 1099 workers, and they enjoy that flexibility. And so I think at the federal level, we've got to be careful about legislation that would make it difficult for workers who may be in those industries that are going to start to reopen to be able to have that independent work, contract work available to them.
That's a great point. I couldn't agree more. This committee, the Republican members anyway on this committee, have been very vocal about reopening our schools. And one of the things that I would like to point out in this hearing is that obviously when you have virtual learning, it's not the same quality as in-person learning. And could you touch on the fact that, we've affected in my opinion, future female leaders because our schools have been shut down over the past year, especially in the bigger cities where the teachers unions are more prevalent and more adverse to keeping the schools shut down. Could you touch upon that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a dearth of data that looks at performance, that looks at the educational attainment levels of children, how they are doing because of the coronavirus pandemic, being out of schools. And it's not surprisingly that you have many American kids who have fallen behind. And for Black and Brown children, they have fallen far behind. And it's going to be difficult for them to catch up. So I think it is important that American children are able to be back in the classroom. I hesitate to say that virtual learning is all bad, because I think it's how different school systems have implemented virtual learning and virtual education that has made some of the difference. I mean, there's certainly been online schools that have been tremendously successful. So, I think we want to ensure that our kids are learning in the best environments possible. And when you look at measures, not just about their educational attainment, but also their mental and emotional health, we see that a lot of students are struggling. And so I do think it's important that our lawmakers make it a priority, and that our school systems make it a priority to reopen safely. And they can do so. We've seen it in the private sector, and we've seen it in other countries.
Absolutely. Just a couple of more things real quick. My time's running out. There's been a lot of discussion today, obviously, about how achieving equal salaries between men and women will prove we've been successful in closing the pay gap. Do you think that's true?
I don't. I mean, I think from a broader perspective, I'm about ensuring everyone has equal opportunities, not just equal, not just looking at it from a wage gap or raw data perspective, because I think that we want to ensure every woman has the opportunities, has the choices that are best for them. And those low earning women are able to move up and up the economic scale and economic ladder. And I don't think there's been enough discussion about how we do that. Not just supporting them at a level of these basic needs, but how do we give people a pathway forward and a path up the economic ladder to really achieve their American dream?
And Madam Chair, last question, because I think this is very important for the purpose of this hearing. What's the best way to gauge workplace equity? Or workplace equality, rather. Yeah, sorry.
I mean, I think I think you have research agencies or institutes like Pew that looks at that actually ask people, how are they doing in the workplace? Are they getting the salaries, or are they getting the flexibility? Whatever it is that they value most, are they able to achieve that? And as we measure that, I think that tells us more about the health of the American worker than just a raw average gap that's not even apples to apples comparison.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Madam Chair, I yield back.
And the gentleman from California, Mr. DeSagne, is now recognized. Mr. DeSagne.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for this very, very important hearing. Dr. Mason, I wanted to ask you two areas of questions. In this historic period of, unfortunately, inequality, where access to capital and savings is so disproportionate, it's more disproportionate than any other time in our history when you measure the percentage of capital in our GDP versus wages. So we know from your work and others that this inequality is particularly difficult for women and women of color. I think your research says that the median savings for a single white American woman is $15,000. For a Hispanic Latino single woman, it's $200, and for an African American single woman, it's $100. So we know wages, if you don't have enough in wages, in addition to high cost areas like the one I live in San Francisco, where transportation, housing costs are so such a challenge, that all of this compresses the opportunity. So that's one response that I'd like you to tell me about, is this problem with getting access to capital, particularly in a country where access to capital, if you have a lot of money, America's not a bad place to live right now. And that the Trump tax cuts, 90% of the benefit of that went to people who make over $500,000 a year, who are predominantly white. So there's that. And then the second one that always troubles me is I don't think Americans realize with the advent of two incomes in the workforce from households, and America was a leader in this, we didn't provide the infrastructure to help with that. The employers got most of the benefit. And I think of reading the book Perfect Madness in 2004 by Judith Warner and rereading that and just being shocked at her experience and her research when she moved from Washington and then went to Europe and saw what they had done, providing universal quality childcare, access to transportation, and those things. So those two areas, I'd really like to hear your response. And that's for Dr. Mason.
Sorry. So the number one barrier to escaping poverty is poverty, and that includes low wages, housing insecurity, food insecurity, and all those things have been exacerbated, during the pandemic. And what we have also seen during the pandemic is that people who were doing well before the pandemic are doing extremely well right now, and women and people who were struggling are sinking. And so wages have not kept pace with inflation. And again, wage workers are the ones that are disproportionately suffering. When we just did a recent survey, speaking of surveys, and we found that women do want the government to play an active role in ensuring pay equity and passing policies that are fair and equitable. And we also learned through the survey is that most women in their savings and checking account had less than $1,000 in both accounts, and 15% of women had less than $400. So when we look at inequality, we have to understand that this is historic, this is compounded, and it's cumulative. And we actually, in this moment, need clear structural and institutional changes to make sure that we can build a more equitable and fair economy.
And then the follow-up, the Perfect Madness question, just what the rest of the industrialized world has done to help women, knowing that our issues around women of color are even worse. Just, I don't think Americans realize how far behind we are.
We are really far behind. In fact, when we think about our care policies, the U.S. spends less than 1% of its GDP on family and care policies. We're only above Ireland and Ireland and Turkey. And if we had labor force participations, as high as Denmark for women, we would see $16 billion added to the GDP. So we have clear decisions to make. This is not about, it's whether it's a hoax or not. These are the facts on the ground, and we need to make and take this opportunity to correct some of the issues that we've been raising during this hearing.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for all your work in this field. It's really important. And I do think the competitive advantage that I hear from a lot of my friends across the aisle in terms of the global economy is one that is missing as well. For the morality of what we need to do in this country and the acknowledgement of the historic implicit biases and prejudice. The only way for us to fix this is to acknowledge that and then pursue policies that other countries have that put them at a competitive advantage over us. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Vice Chair Gomez is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've heard almost everything in this committee. When I started, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, the Republicans, would say that climate change didn't exist. Last year, in the beginning of the pandemic, they were trying to make arguments and convince Dr. Fauci that COVID-19 wasn't as deadly as just the normal flu. Yeah, that sounds as preposterous as that sounds. That's the argument that they were making just last year. And now we have 530,000 Americans who have died of COVID-19. On an average year, anywhere from 30 to 60,000 Americans die from the flu. But they were making that argument. And now the argument we're hearing is that they're trying to make the argument that the gender pay gap doesn't exist. And if it does, it's really small. And if it does exist, it's because women made certain choices. And I want to be very, very clear for everyone out there. Until there is a choice that a man can have babies and women don't have to have the babies, then there's no real choice at all, right? At all. So this is something that they're trying to convince people is that these choices have led to this decision. I think it is completely preposterous. Also, women have been fighting to create equal pay and equal benefits and to have the same kind of status in their employment as men for decades. I used to work for a nurses association, the United Nurses Association of California. They formed in 1972. And the reason why they formed is because the doctors had healthcare benefits and dental benefits, and they did not. Nurses that worked for Kaiser did not have dental benefits back in 1972. Simple things like that right now would be like, duh, but those disparities existed. And then even if you look at different programs out there, you see those disparities. Also, my colleagues, they talk about how they want flexibility. People want flexibility. Why does only flexibility matter when it comes to a woman and not a man? Nobody ever asked the man, hey, do you want flexibility so you can take time off to take care of a sick family member or a child? Nobody asked the man that. But when it comes to women, that's the one factor that they care most about, which is preposterous, right? Because we've seen that when we give choices, even in California where we expanded paid family leave, that women take it at a higher rate than men. I'm proud to say that men are starting to take it more and more and more, which is great. But it's still the caregiving. When somebody gets sick, it is women that take that burden. So you take them out of the workforce. So it is preposterous. And then when they had a chance to help millions of women by raising the minimum wage, they voted en masse against it, right? So when my mother was working 4 or 5 jobs a week, it wasn't much of a choice because we were struggling on 100% of her salary to make ends meet, to put food on the table and a roof over our head. So this whole red herring that it's a choice is just BS, right? BS. So I know the benefits of a strong paid family leave program. It can be tremendous, but how do we actually do it in a way that is equitable, equitable? How do we do it in a way that benefits everybody? That's something that I've learned here in California. We need to make sure that they have job protection below for smaller employees. They need to make sure that they can return to their job. They have also wage replacement that is sufficient for a worker to take that time off. And then at the same time, we want to make sure that they also know about the program. That's one of the things that we need to do. So I just want to say I want to thank all the witnesses here today. Equal pay for equal work is still a real thing. I believe everybody asked the questions on paid family leave, but we need to make sure that we have a robust paid family leave protection. We implement laws that also don't discriminate against individuals who took lower paying jobs in the past, like not revealing your salary data from previous employers makes a difference, because often women and people of color often get, I don't want to say screwed, but they get screwed when it comes to that first job out of college, right? And then that sets the scale for how they get raises in the future. There's so many different things in policy. I want to say thank you for attending. And this was, I'm glad we had this hearing, but there's my colleagues on the other side of the aisle need to see the light when it comes to a lot of these issues, including the gender pay equity gap. Thank you so much, and I yield back to the chair.
The gentleman yields back. And without objection, the following items supporting legislative proposals to close the gender pay gap will be entered into the record. A report from the Time's Up Foundation entitled, "It's Time to Care." A letter from the National Partnership for Women and Families. A statement by Professor Julie Sook. A report from IWPR submitted by Dr. C. Nicole Mason. Before we close, I'd like to offer the ranking member an opportunity to offer any closing remarks that he may have. Ranking Member Comer, you are now recognized. Mr. Comer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And again, we want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. And certainly, I think the one thing that we all agree on is that women should receive the same amount of pay as men for the same type of work and the same type of work product. The question is, who determines what equal pay is? Who determines what the same amount of work is? These are the questions that we've tried to ask. These are the problems with the bill. These are the concerns that people in the private sector have. You know, I like to point out that I was Commissioner of Agriculture for 4 years. I led an agency of probably on average 275 employees. The three highest employees in my agency were female. They were non-married employees that I hired. I have a congressional office. What do we have? 14 employees. My two highest paid employees are female. That's not because they're female. It's because they're the best employee. And have a private sector business, a highest paid employee is a female. Not, again, because the government told me to, not because that's the law, because I want the best employees. And I think that in the private sector, supply and demand usually plays out with credible companies that want to hire the best people. I think we live in a new normal because of the COVID. I think there's going to be more work from home. I think this is a situation that's going to create opportunities for some, and I'm more than willing to work with the committee on solutions moving forward. But I do think that this was a productive hearing. I congratulate you all on having some great witnesses. We were proud of our witness too, and look forward to hopefully future hearings on things like border security, because we have a crisis at the border. Hopefully, if these schools aren't reopened in some of these bigger cities, that we'll have hearings to discuss the science of that. And I think that we have a lot of great opportunities moving forward, Madam Chair. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I now recognize myself for a closing statement. We've heard some sobering testimony today from a truly impressive and diverse group of women. I applaud their hard work and continued fight for equality. We know that the pay gap exists. We know that it impacts women over their entire lifetimes, resulting in older women being the largest segment of poverty in our country. We know the coronavirus pandemic is hitting women the hardest, precisely because we have not addressed these systemic inequalities. Let's not wait until the next crisis hits to act. Let's get at the root of the problem now for ourselves, for our mothers, our daughters, our sisters, our neighbors, and for those who are suffering much more than we can ever imagine. I have seen so much progress for women during my lifetime and my tenure in Congress, but we still have a long road to go. Let this be the last Equal Pay Day we ever have to commemorate, because hard-working people of all genders deserve to be fairly compensated for their work. In closing, I want to thank our panelists for their remarks, and I want to commend my colleagues for participating so strongly in this important conversation. With that, and without objection, all members have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you can. This hearing is adjourned.